Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another volume of true scary stories. I'm here with you tonight to help you drift off to sleep with some genuinely chilling tales that will send shivers down your spine while somehow managing to relax your mind. Before we begin our journey into the darkness, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if these stories help you find peaceful rest. I'm always curious about where my listeners are tuning in from, so drop a comment letting me know your location and what time it is as you settle in for the night. Now get comfortable in your bed, adjust your pillows just right, and let the gentle sound of rain wash over you as we explore some truly unsettling experiences that real people have lived through. Tonight's collection features stories that blur the line between the natural and supernatural, between what we can explain and what defies all logic. So close your eyes, let your breathing slow, and allow these tales to carry you into the realm of sleep. Our first story comes from a woman named Rachel, who worked at an assisted living facility in rural as a night nurse in Pennsylvania. The Willowbrook Care Center sat at the end of a winding country road, surrounded by ancient oak trees that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. Rachel had been working the overnight shift for nearly 2 years, and she thought she knew every sound the old building made, every creak and groan that came with settling foundations and aging pipes. It was during a particularly quiet October evening that Rachel first noticed something unusual. She was making her rounds through the dimly lit corridors, checking on residents and ensuring everyone was sleeping peacefully. The facility housed 43 elderly patients, most of whom had been there for years, living out their final chapters in relative comfort and care. As Rachel passed room 27, she heard the sound of gentle humming coming from within. This wasn't entirely unusual, as some residents experienced restless nights and would sometimes sing softly to themselves. However, room 27 had been empty for 3 weeks, ever since its previous occupant, Mrs. Henderson, had passed away peacefully in her sleep. Rachel paused outside the door, listening more carefully. The humming was melodic and soothing, an old lullaby that her own grandmother used to sing. She pushed open the door slowly, expecting to find that perhaps another resident had wandered into the wrong room during a bout of confusion. The room was empty, but the humming continued for several more seconds before fading away entirely. Over the following weeks, the incidents in room 27 became more frequent and more elaborate. Rachel would find the bed covers pulled back neatly, as if someone had just risen for the morning. The old rocking chair in the corner would be gently swaying when she entered, despite the absence of any draft or movement that could explain the motion. Most disturbing of all, the room began to carry the faint scent of lavender soap, the exact brand that Mrs. Henderson had used daily during her stay. Rachel tried to rationalize these occurrences. Old buildings had their quirks, and the heating system could create air currents that might move lightweight objects. The lingering scent could simply be embedded in the furniture and fabrics, taking time to fully dissipate. But as the weeks turned into months, the explanations became harder to maintain. Other staff members began to notice unusual activity as well. The day shift nurses reported finding fresh flowers in the room, despite no deliveries being made and no family members having visited. The maintenance crew discovered that the thermostat in room 27 would reset itself to exactly 72 degrees, no matter how many times they adjusted it. Security cameras showed nothing unusual, yet the motion sensors in the room would occasionally trigger in the middle of the night. One evening in December, Rachel encountered something that shook her to her core. She was passing room 27 around 3 in the morning when she heard not humming, but actual conversation. 2 voices, both elderly and female, were chatting quietly about the weather and upcoming holiday plans. Rachel recognized one of the voices immediately as belonging to Mrs. Henderson. though she had been dead for over 2 months. When Rachel pushed open the door, the conversation stopped abruptly. The room appeared empty as always, but the air felt different somehow, charged with a presence that made her skin prickle. She noticed that the old photo album Mrs. Henderson's family had left behind was open on the nightstand, displaying pictures of family gatherings and birthday celebrations from decades past. As winter deepened, the activity in room 27 reached a crescendo. Rachel began to see fleeting glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision when passing the room. Shadows that seemed too substantial to be tricks of light would drift across the walls. The rocking chair would be found positioned at different angles, always facing the window that looked out onto the facility's memorial garden. The breaking point came on a snowy February night when Rachel was called to investigate a disturbance. Multiple residents had complained about hearing music and laughter coming from the empty room. When Rachel arrived, she could indeed hear the sounds of what seemed to be a small gathering, complete with clinking glasses and gentle piano music. She opened the door to find the room transformed. Though still physically empty, it somehow felt full of presence and warmth. The temperature was noticeably warmer than the hallway, and the scent of lavender was so strong it was almost overwhelming. On the nightstand, she found a handwritten note in Mrs. Henderson's distinctive script, though she had watched the woman's family clear out all personal belongings months earlier. The note was simple, but profound. "Thank you for caring for us. We're not gone, just different. The room remembers love, and love never truly dies. Keep watching over the living ones, dear. They need you more than we do." Rachel kept that note in her pocket for the remainder of her time at Willowbrook. The activity in room 27 gradually subsided over the following months, though it never disappeared entirely. New residents who were assigned to the room often reported feeling unusually peaceful and well-rested, as if they were being watched over by benevolent presences. Years later, when Rachel moved on to a different position, she learned from a longtime employee that Mrs. Henderson had not been the first resident to seemingly linger in room 27 after death. The room had a long history of providing comfort to both the living and the departed, serving as a bridge between worlds where love transcended the boundaries of mortality. Our second tale takes us to the mountains of Colorado, where Forest Service employee David Martinez was stationed alone at a remote fire lookout tower during the peak of wildfire season. The Granite Peak Observation Post stood at an elevation of nearly 9,000 feet, accessible only by a treacherous dirt road that wound through dense pine forests for 12 miles. David had volunteered for the isolated assignment, seeking solitude after a difficult divorce and custody battle. The tower offered him the peace he craved, with nothing but endless wilderness stretching in every direction. His duties were straightforward: watch for signs of smoke or fire, monitor weather conditions, and radio in regular reports to the district office. The first week passed without incident. David settled into a comfortable routine of observation duties, maintenance tasks, and quiet evenings reading by lamplight. The silence was profound at such altitude, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. It was during his second week that David first noticed the footprints. He discovered them during his morning inspection of the tower's perimeter, clearly defined boot prints in the soft earth around the structure's base. The prints appeared to have been made during the night, forming a complete circle around the tower at a distance of roughly 50 feet. What made the discovery particularly unsettling was the fact that David had heard nothing during the night. No footsteps, no voices, no sounds of approach or departure. The access road was the only way to reach the tower, and it would be impossible for someone to hike through the dense forest without making considerable noise. Additionally, the prints showed no approach or departure trail, as if whoever made them had simply materialized at the first point and vanished at the last. David radioed the district office to report the incident, but his supervisor seemed unconcerned. Hikers sometimes wandered off established trails, and the isolation of the tower might attract curious visitors despite the restricted access. David was advised to secure his equipment and report any direct contact with trespassers. The footprints appeared again 3 nights later, following the same circular pattern but slightly closer to the tower. This time, David had made a point of staying awake and alert throughout the night, positioning himself at the observation deck where he could see the entire perimeter. Despite his vigilance, he saw nothing and heard nothing. Yet the morning revealed fresh prints in the dew-dampened soil. As the days passed, the mysterious visitor continued their nocturnal circles, each night drawing incrementally closer to the tower. David began to feel genuinely unnerved by the situation. The isolation that had initially provided comfort now felt oppressive and threatening. He found himself jumping at every sound, checking and rechecking the locks on the tower's access door. On the 10th night of the visits, David decided to take direct action. He positioned himself with a powerful flashlight and camera, determined to catch whoever was circling his tower. He remained alert throughout the entire night, scanning the forest edge and listening for any sound of approach. At approximately 3 in the morning, David's flashlight beam caught something that made his blood run cold. A figure stood at the tree line, just barely visible in the darkness beyond his light's reach. The person appeared to be wearing dark clothing and seemed to be watching the tower with an intensity that was palpable even at distance. David called out, identifying himself as Forest Service personnel and demanding that the person identify themselves and state their business. The figure remained motionless and silent for several long minutes before slowly raising one arm in what might have been a wave or a gesture of acknowledgement. Then, without any sound or sudden movement, the figure simply faded from view, as if dissolving into the darkness itself. The next morning brought the usual circle of footprints, but these were different. They were deeper, more clearly defined, and they came within 20 feet of the tower's base. More disturbing still, David found what appeared to be a message carved into the bark of a nearby pine tree. The letters were crude, but legible. Soon. David's hands trembled as he traced the carved letters with his fingertip. The bark was still fresh around the cuts, sap bleeding slowly in the cool mountain air. He grabbed his radio and called the district office immediately, his voice cracking as he described the escalating situation. The response was swift and decisive. A ranger would be dispatched to escort him down from the tower within 24 hours. But 24 hours felt like an eternity when night began to fall. David barricaded himself inside the tower, pushing furniture against the door and windows. He kept every light burning, creating a beacon of illumination that pushed back against the encroaching darkness of the forest. The generator hummed loudly, its mechanical drone providing some comfort against the oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. Around midnight, the circling began again. This time, David could hear it. Soft footsteps in the dried pine needles, moving with deliberate precision around the tower's perimeter. The sound was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, like a ritual dance being performed in the darkness below. David pressed his face to the window, straining to see through the glass, but his own reflected light obscured everything beyond. The footsteps stopped directly beneath his position. In the sudden silence, David held his breath, listening so intently that his ears began to ring. Then came a sound that would haunt him for years to come. Someone was climbing the tower's external ladder. Each rung creaked under weight, metal groaning against metal as the unseen visitor ascended toward the observation deck. David backed away from the windows, his heart hammering against his ribs. The climbing sounds continued steadily upward, accompanied by what might have been breathing, heavy and labored with exertion. When the sounds reached the level of the observation deck, they stopped. David could hear movement on the narrow walkway that circled the tower's exterior, slow and deliberate steps that paused at each window as if someone were peering inside. A shadow passed across the northern window, then the eastern one. David grabbed his flashlight and camera, knowing he needed evidence of what was happening. As the shadow approached the southern window, he positioned himself and waited. When the darkness moved across the glass, he triggered both the camera flash and the flashlight simultaneously, flooding the area with brilliant white light. The image that burned into his retinas in that split second of illumination would never leave him. A face pressed against the glass, but it was wrong in every possible way. The features were human but distorted, as if viewed through water or heat shimmer. The eyes were too large, too dark, reflecting the light like an animal's. Most disturbing of all, the mouth was open in what might have been a scream or a laugh, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp and too numerous. The light coiled from the sudden figure and vanished with impossible speed. David heard no sounds of retreat, no footsteps on the ladder or walkway. The forest returned to its oppressive silence, as if nothing had happened at all. When he developed the camera film weeks later, it showed only darkness and his own reflection in the window glass. The rescue ranger arrived the next morning to find David in a state of near-complete exhaustion. He had not slept, had barely eaten, and spoke in fragmented sentences about watchers in the woods and faces at the windows. The tower was immediately evacuated, and David was taken to a medical facility for evaluation and treatment. The official report listed the incident as a case of severe isolation-induced stress and hallucination. The tower was reassigned to a two-person team, and new protocols were established for monitoring the psychological health of personnel in remote positions. But the local Forest Service employees whispered among themselves about other incidents at Granite Peak, stories going back decades of watchers in the woods and night visitors who left no trace except in the shattered nerves of those who encountered them. Our third story brings us to the suburban neighborhood of Maplewood Heights, where the Thompson family had recently moved into their dream home. The house was a beautiful colonial revival built in the 1920s, complete with original hardwood floors, crown molding, and a wraparound porch that overlooked mature oak trees. Sarah and Michael Thompson, along with their 8-year-old daughter Emma, had fallen in love with the property's charm and character. The move-in process had gone smoothly, and the family quickly settled into their new routines. Emma started at the local elementary school. Sarah resumed her work as a freelance graphic designer from her new home office, and Michael commuted to his job in the city. Everything seemed perfect, exactly what they had envisioned when they decided to leave their cramped apartment for suburban family life. The first unusual incident occurred during their third week in the house. Sarah was working late in her office when she heard what sounded like footsteps in the hallway above. She assumed Michael had gotten up to check on Emma, but when she went upstairs to say goodnight, she found both her husband and daughter fast asleep. The hallway was empty and quiet, illuminated only by the soft glow of the nightlight they had installed near Emma's room. Over the following days, the family began to notice other small oddities. Doors that they were certain they had closed would be found standing open. The temperature in certain rooms would fluctuate dramatically without any apparent cause, sometimes dropping so suddenly that their breath would mist in the air. Most puzzling of all, they would occasionally catch the faint scent of pipe tobacco drifting through the house, despite the fact that none of them smoked. Emma was the first to report seeing someone in the house. She told her parents about the nice old man who would sit in the rocking chair in her bedroom corner, smoking his pipe and watching her sleep. Sarah and Michael initially dismissed this as typical childhood imagination, perhaps triggered by the stress of moving to a new home and school. But Emma's descriptions were remarkably consistent and detailed. According to Emma, the man wore a brown sweater vest and wire-rimmed glasses. He had kind eyes and would sometimes wave at her when she woke up during the night. He never spoke, she explained, but his presence made her feel safe rather than frightened. She began referring to him as Grandpa George, though neither Sarah nor Michael could explain where she had gotten that particular name. The situation escalated when Sarah began experiencing her own encounters. She would glimpse movement in her peripheral vision while working, always in the same corner of her office where an old writing desk sat beneath the window. When she would turn to look directly, nothing would be there, but the sensation of being observed would linger for several minutes. Michael remained skeptical until the night he encountered the presence himself. He had gotten up around 2 a.m. to get a glass of water from the kitchen when he noticed a warm glow emanating from the living room. Thinking someone had left a lamp on, he went to turn it off and found an elderly man sitting in the leather armchair by the fireplace, reading what appeared to be a newspaper. The man looked up at Michael's approach and nodded politely, as if acknowledging a neighbor during an evening stroll. His appearance matched Emma's descriptions perfectly. Brown sweater vest, wire-rimmed glasses, and a gentle demeanor that seemed utterly non-threatening. For a moment, the two men simply regarded each other in silence, each seeming to wait for the other to speak first. Then, as quietly as he had appeared, the figure began to fade. Michael watched in fascination rather than fear as the man became translucent, then disappeared entirely, leaving only the faint aroma of pipe tobacco and the impression of a presence that had been both real and impossible. The next day, the family decided to research the history of their house. A visit to the local historical society revealed that the previous owner had been George Whitman, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the house for over 40 years. According to the records, George had been known throughout the neighborhood as a gentle, scholarly man who enjoyed reading and smoking his pipe on the front porch. He had passed away peacefully in his sleep just 2 years before the Thompsons purchased the property. Armed with this information, the family's attitude toward their supernatural housemate shifted dramatically. Rather than feeling threatened or disturbed, they began to view George's presence as a comforting connection to the house's history. Emma continued to report occasional visits from Grandpa George, and both Sarah and Michael would occasionally catch glimpses of him in various rooms throughout the house. The presence seemed particularly drawn to moments of family togetherness. He would appear during birthday celebrations, holiday gatherings, and quiet evenings when the family was reading or watching movies together. His manifestations were always brief and peaceful, never interfering with their activities, but simply observing with what appeared to be grandfatherly approval. As months passed, the Thompson family came to accept George as an integral part of their household. They would sometimes catch themselves setting an extra place at the dinner table or leaving his favorite chair unoccupied during family gatherings. Emma would occasionally leave drawings on the mantelpiece for him, and Sarah found herself unconsciously avoiding rearranging furniture in areas where he seemed to prefer spending time. The encounters gradually became less frequent as the family settled more fully into the house's rhythms. George's appearances became special occasions rather than regular occurrences, as if he was slowly accepting that the house was in good hands and his watchful presence was no longer as necessary. But he never disappeared entirely, remaining as a gentle guardian spirit who had chosen to share his beloved home with the living family who had come to care for it as deeply as he had. Our fourth and final story for this evening takes us to the coastal town of Beacon Harbor, Maine, where lighthouse keeper Thomas Reed maintained the automated beacon that had guided ships safely to harbor for over a century. Though modern GPS technology had largely replaced the need for traditional lighthouse navigation, the historic structure remained operational as both a maritime aid and tourist attraction. Thomas lived alone in the keeper's quarters attached to the lighthouse, a solitary existence that suited his introverted nature perfectly. He had taken the position after retiring from a career in marine engineering, drawn by the opportunity to tend to a piece of maritime history while enjoying the peace and solitude of coastal life. His duties were relatively simple: maintain the automated systems, conduct regular inspections, and provide tours to visitors during the summer months. The lighthouse had been built in 1857 and had weathered countless storms, shipwrecks, and changes in maritime technology. Its thick stone walls and sturdy construction had stood firm against decades of harsh coastal weather, and Thomas took pride in maintaining its pristine condition. He had developed a deep respect for the generations of keepers who had preceded him, men who had risked their lives to keep the beacon burning during the most dangerous storms. It was during a particularly violent nor'easter in late October that Thomas first encountered something that challenged his understanding of the lighthouse's history. The storm had been battering the coast for 2 days, with winds exceeding 60 miles per hour and waves crashing against the rocky shore with tremendous force. Thomas had secured all the exterior equipment and was monitoring the weather reports when he noticed something unusual about the lighthouse beam. The automated rotation system was functioning normally, but the light itself seemed to be pulsing in an irregular pattern, instead of the steady, consistent beam that ships had relied upon for guidance. The light was flashing in what appeared to be a deliberate sequence. Thomas climbed to the lamp room to investigate, expecting to find a malfunction in the electrical system. What he discovered defied all logical explanation. The lamp was operating normally, its powerful beam cutting through the storm-darkened sky with mechanical precision. But superimposed over the electric light was another illumination entirely. A warmer, more flickering glow that pulsed with the rhythm of an oil flame. Thomas could see both lights simultaneously, the modern beam and its ghostly predecessor, creating a layered illumination that seemed to exist in multiple time periods at once. As he watched in fascination, the oil flame's rhythm became more pronounced, flashing in the distinctive pattern of Morse code. Thomas, familiar with maritime communication from his engineering background, began to decode the message. Ship in distress. Northeast rocks. All hands lost. The message repeated continuously throughout the night, its urgent rhythm cutting through the howling wind and crashing waves. Thomas searched the dark waters with binoculars, but could see nothing beyond the storm's fury. Coast Guard radio channels reported no vessels in distress, no emergency calls, no missing ships. Yet the ghostly beacon continued its desperate transmission, warning of a disaster that seemed to exist only in the past. When dawn finally broke, Thomas discovered something that sent chills through his very soul. Scattered along the rocky shoreline below the lighthouse were pieces of weathered driftwood, arranged in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Among the debris, he found fragments of what appeared to be ship timbers, their surfaces blackened and scarred by fire and salt water. Most disturbing of all was a piece of carved wood bearing partial letters that spelled out M-A-R-Y-E-L in faded paint. Thomas spent the morning researching maritime records at the local historical society. What he discovered made his hands tremble as he turned the yellowed pages of old logbooks. In November of 1873, During a storm remarkably similar to the previous night's nor'easter, a merchant vessel called the Mary Elizabeth had foundered on the northeast rocks, exactly where the ghostly beacon had indicated. All 17 crew members had perished, their bodies never recovered from the churning waters. The lighthouse keeper at that time, according to the records, had been a man named Samuel Morrison. His final log entry, dated the night of the disaster, described his desperate attempts to guide the Mary Elizabeth to safety with the oil-burning beacon. Morrison had manually operated the light throughout the storm, flashing warning signals until exhaustion overcame him. By morning, both the ship and its crew were gone, leaving only wreckage on the rocks below. Thomas returned to the lighthouse with a profound sense of understanding. The ghostly beacon he had witnessed was not some supernatural phenomenon, but rather an echo of Samuel Morrison's heroic efforts to save lives during that long-ago storm. The lighthouse itself seemed to hold the memory of that tragic night, replaying the keeper's valiant struggle whenever conditions mirrored those of the original disaster. Over the following months, Thomas experienced several more encounters with his predecessor's spirit. During severe storms, he would hear footsteps in the lamp room above his quarters, the sound of someone climbing the iron stairs with urgent purpose. Sometimes he would find the manual controls for the beacon moved slightly, as if invisible hands had been adjusting the beam's focus and intensity. Rather than feeling frightened by these manifestations, Thomas found himself developing a deep respect for Samuel Morrison's dedication. He began researching the previous keeper's life, learning about his 20-year tenure at the lighthouse and his reputation among local mariners as a man who never failed to maintain the beacon during dangerous weather. Morrison had died at his post during a winter storm in 1881, found the next morning slumped over the lamp controls, having worked through the night to guide ships safely through treacherous conditions. Thomas started leaving small offerings in the lamp room, a cup of coffee on particularly stormy nights, or fresh flowers on the anniversary of Morrison's death. These gestures seemed to bring peace to the restless spirit, and the supernatural activity gradually became less dramatic. Instead of urgent footsteps and moving controls, Thomas would simply sense a presence during his evening rounds, as if Morrison were conducting his own inspection alongside the living keeper. The lighthouse's ghostly guardian revealed himself most clearly during a crisis that tested both keepers across the centuries. A modern cargo vessel, caught in an unexpected squall, had lost its GPS navigation and was drifting dangerously close to the same rocks that had claimed the Mary Elizabeth over a century earlier. Thomas was monitoring the situation from the lamp room when he felt an overwhelming compulsion to switch to manual control of the beacon. Working in perfect synchronization with hands he could not see but could definitely feel guiding his movements, Thomas operated the lighthouse beam with an expertise that transcended his own experience. The light flashed in complex patterns, spelling out warnings and navigation instructions in the maritime code that Morrison had mastered during his decades of service. The cargo ship's crew responded to the signals, adjusting their course and reaching safe harbor just as the storm reached its full intensity. Later investigation revealed that the ship's captain had been puzzled by the lighthouse's unusual signaling pattern, which seemed to follow 19th century maritime protocols rather than modern navigation aids. The signals had been perfectly accurate and ultimately life-saving, but they had been delivered in a style of communication that had been obsolete for decades. Thomas never explained the true source of those expert navigation instructions, knowing that some truths were too extraordinary for official reports. As winter settled over Beacon Harbor, Thomas found himself settling into a routine that accommodated both his duties and Morrison's lingering presence. The lighthouse operated smoothly under their shared stewardship, its beacon burning steadily through the long coastal nights. During the harshest storms, Thomas would feel his predecessor's presence most strongly, a comforting reminder that he was part of a tradition stretching back generations. The townspeople began to notice changes in the lighthouse's operation under Thomas's care. The beacon seemed brighter during dangerous weather, its beam more precisely focused on hazardous areas that threatened maritime traffic. Local fishermen reported that the light's guidance felt more intuitive, as if the lighthouse itself possessed an intelligence that understood the nuances of coastal navigation. Thomas documented these experiences in his own logbook, creating a record that future keepers might find useful in understanding the lighthouse's unique character. He wrote about the sounds of phantom footsteps, the sensation of invisible assistance during storms, and the profound sense of continuity that connected him to the generations of keepers who had preceded him. As our evening of stories draws toward its close, Thomas continues his vigil at Beacon Harbor Lighthouse. The rain that has accompanied our tales tonight mirrors the storms that have tested lighthouse keepers for generations, each drop carrying whispers of the past into the present. In his keeper's quarters, Thomas maintains both the modern automated systems and the timeless traditions that have guided mariners safely home for over a century. The lighthouse beam continues its eternal rotation, cutting through darkness and weather with unwavering determination. Sometimes it carries just the electric glow of modern technology, and sometimes it bears the additional warmth of an oil flame that burned out long ago, but refuses to be extinguished. Together, past and present, keepers ensure that no ship will founder on the rocks below. No crew will join the ghostly roster of those claimed by the unforgiving sea. These stories remind us that some places hold memories so powerful they transcend the boundaries between past and present, between the living and the dead. Whether in the corridors of a care facility, the isolation of a mountain lookout, the rooms of a family home, or the beacon of a coastal lighthouse, these encounters speak to something fundamental about the human experience and our connections to the spaces we inhabit and the people who inhabited them before us. The gentle patter of rain continues outside your window, washing the world clean and preparing it for tomorrow's possibilities. Let these tales settle into your mind like sediment in still water, becoming part of the deeper currents of sleep that will carry you through the night. In dreams, perhaps you too will encounter the echoes of those who came before, finding comfort in the knowledge that love, dedication, and human connection can transcend even death itself. The rain outside grows heavier now, each droplet carrying with it the weight of untold stories and forgotten memories. As we continue our journey through these true encounters with the unexplained, let yourself sink deeper into the comfort of your bed, allowing the rhythmic percussion of water against glass to guide you toward peaceful rest. Our fifth tale originates from the small college town of Cedar Falls, where graduate student Jennifer Walsh was conducting research in the basement archives of the university library. The building itself dated back to 1903, its Gothic Revival architecture creating an atmosphere of scholarly solemnity that had inspired generations of students and faculty. Jennifer was working on her thesis about regional folklore, spending countless hours surrounded by dusty volumes and forgotten manuscripts that few people had touched in decades. The archives occupied the entire basement level, a labyrinth of narrow corridors lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves. The fluorescent lighting was sporadic and unreliable, leaving many sections in perpetual shadow, broken only by the pools of light cast by reading lamps scattered throughout the space. Jennifer had grown comfortable in this subterranean world of knowledge, often working alone well into the evening hours when the rest of the library had closed to the public. It was during one such late-night research session that Jennifer first heard the typing. The sound was distinctive and unmistakable, the sharp, staccato rhythm of manual typewriter keys striking paper with mechanical precision. This was puzzling because the archives contained no typewriters, only modern computers and reading stations equipped with the latest technology for document preservation and digital scanning. The typing seemed to emanate from the far end of the archives, in a section devoted to university records from the early 20th century. Jennifer followed the sound through the maze of shelves, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished concrete floor. As she drew closer, she could make out not just the typing, but also the subtle sounds that accompanied it. The soft whisper of paper being fed into a machine, the gentle ring of a carriage return, even the faint scratch of someone making corrections with an eraser. When she reached the source of the sounds, Jennifer found herself standing before an empty reading station. The typing continued for several more seconds before stopping abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete that her own breathing seemed unnaturally loud. On the desk sat a single piece of paper that had not been there moments before, its surface bearing several lines of text typed in the distinctive font of a manual typewriter. The message was brief but startling. Miss Walsh, your research into the Henderson collection requires additional context. Please examine Box 47B, Shelf 12, Section M. The answers you seek regarding the folklore of Cedar County are contained within. Signed, Professor E. Whitmore. Jennifer stared at the paper in confusion and growing unease. Professor E. Whitmore had been the head of the English department during the 1940s and 50s, a man renowned for his expertise in regional folklore and oral traditions. He had died in 1973, over 50 years ago. Yet here was a message bearing his name and written in response to her current research project. More disturbing still was the fact that no one else knew the specific details of her thesis topic. She had not yet presented her research to her advisor, had not discussed the Henderson collection with anyone, and had kept her work entirely confidential until she could develop a more comprehensive understanding of the materials. Yet somehow, this impossible message demonstrated intimate knowledge of her project and offered guidance that seemed almost too relevant to dismiss. Despite her rational mind's protests, Jennifer found herself walking to Section M and locating Box 47B on Shelf 12. The container was covered in decades of dust, its label so faded as to be barely legible. Inside, she discovered a treasure trove of documents that would revolutionize her understanding of Cedar County folklore. Handwritten interviews with local storytellers, transcripts of oral histories, and detailed notes about supernatural encounters dating back to the area's earliest settlement. The materials were exactly what her research needed, providing context and verification for stories she had been struggling to authenticate. More remarkably, many of the documents were annotated in the same handwriting that had appeared on Professor Whitmore's typewritten message, as if he had been preparing these materials specifically for her eventual discovery. Over the following weeks, Jennifer's nocturnal visits to the archives became increasingly productive and increasingly strange. The typing would resume whenever she encountered difficulties in her research, always leading her to relevant materials she might otherwise have overlooked. Sometimes she would find handwritten notes appearing on her desk, offering insights into the historical context of particular folklore traditions or suggesting new avenues of investigation. So, the ghostly assistance was never intrusive or demanding. Professor Whitmore's spirit seemed content to serve as a guide and mentor, helping Jennifer navigate the complex web of regional stories and oral traditions that formed the backbone of her thesis. His interventions were always scholarly and professional, focused entirely on advancing her academic understanding rather than drawing attention to his own supernatural presence. Jennifer began researching Professor Whitmore's life and career, discovering that he had been working on a comprehensive study of Cedar County folklore at the time of his death. His project had remained unfinished, its materials scattered throughout the archives without proper organization or cataloging. Through his posthumous assistance, Jennifer realized she was essentially completing the work he had begun decades earlier. The collaboration between living researcher and deceased scholar produced remarkable results. Jennifer's thesis became a groundbreaking examination of regional folklore that earned recognition from academic institutions across the country. Her research uncovered stories and traditions that had been lost for generations, preserving them for future scholars and community members interested in their local heritage. As her project neared completion, the supernatural assistance gradually diminished. The typing sounds became less frequent, the helpful notes appeared more sporadically, and the sense of scholarly companionship that had sustained Jennifer through long nights of research began to fade. It was as if Professor Whitmore's spirit had accomplished what it had set out to do, ensuring that his life's work would finally see completion through the dedication of a younger scholar. On the night Jennifer submitted her completed thesis, she found one final message waiting on her usual reading station. Written in Professor Whitmore's familiar handwriting, it simply said, "Well done, Miss Walsh. The stories live on, and knowledge finds its way to those who seek it with genuine purpose. The archives will remember your dedication, as they have remembered mine." Jennifer kept that final note as a bookmark in her personal copy of the completed thesis. Years later, when she had established her own career as a folklore professor, she would return to the archives to conduct research and would occasionally hear the distant sound of typing emanating from the depths of the collection. She never investigated these sounds directly, understanding that Professor Whitmore continued his scholarly work in ways that transcended conventional understanding of life and death. Our sixth story takes us to the industrial district of Detroit, where night security guard Marcus Johnson patrolled the abandoned Riverside manufacturing complex. The facility had been shuttered for over a decade, its massive buildings standing empty as testaments to the city's industrial heritage. Marcus worked for a security company contracted to prevent vandalism and theft, spending his shifts walking through cavernous spaces that had once buzzed with the activity of hundreds of workers. The complex consisted of 5 interconnected buildings spanning nearly 20 acres, their brick facades weathered by years of neglect and exposure to harsh Midwest weather. Inside, the machinery had been removed, leaving behind only the ghostly outlines of production lines and workstations marked by oil stains on the concrete floors. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant hum of heating systems and the occasional settling sounds of aging infrastructure. Marcus had been working the overnight shift at Riverside for 6 months when he first encountered evidence that he was not alone in the abandoned facility. It began with subtle signs. Doors that he distinctly remembered closing would be found standing open during his next patrol round. Lights in sections he had not visited would be illuminated when he passed by windows from the outside. Most puzzling were the lunchboxes and thermoses that would appear on break room tables, as if invisible workers were still reporting for shifts that had ended years ago. The manifestations became more pronounced as winter settled over the complex. Marcus would hear the distant sound of machinery operating, the rhythmic clank and hiss of production equipment that no longer existed. Voices would drift through the empty corridors, conversations between workers discussing quotas and schedules for jobs that would never be completed. The phantom sounds were so realistic that Marcus would often find himself responding to what seemed like direct questions or greetings, only to realize he was speaking to empty air. One particularly cold February night, Marcus encountered something that challenged his understanding of the boundary between past and present. He was conducting his routine patrol of Building 3 when he noticed light spilling from beneath the door of what had been the facility's main production floor. The light had a warm, yellow quality, distinctly different from the harsh, fluorescent illumination of the security systems. When Marcus opened the door, he found himself looking into a scene from the factory's operational heyday. The production line was fully equipped and running, with workers in period clothing operating machinery and moving materials along conveyor belts. The air filled with the familiar industrial sounds of manufacturing, the whir of motors, the clang of metal on metal, and the voices of supervisors calling out instructions over the mechanical din. The workers seemed unaware of Marcus's presence, going about their tasks with the focused efficiency of people who had performed these same motions thousands of times. He recognized some of the faces from old company photographs he had seen in the security office, employees who had worked at Riverside during its most productive decades. They appeared solid and real, casting shadows and interacting with equipment that responded to their touch with appropriate weight and resistance. Marcus stood transfixed in the doorway, watching this impossible scene unfold before him. The shift seemed to be ending as workers began cleaning their stations and gathering their belongings. They moved toward the exit where Marcus stood, and for a moment he wondered if he should step aside to allow them passage. But as the first worker approached, the entire scene began to fade, dissolving like morning mist until only empty concrete and darkness remained. The experience left Marcus shaken, but also oddly comforted. The ghostly workers had seemed content and purposeful, going about their duties with the satisfaction of people engaged in meaningful labor. There was nothing malevolent or threatening about their presence, only a sense of continuity that transcended the factory's physical abandonment. Over the following months, Marcus developed a routine that accommodated these supernatural manifestations. He would time his patrols to avoid disturbing the phantom shifts, learning to recognize the sounds and signs that indicated when the ghostly workers were present. Sometimes he would leave coffee brewing in the break rooms, finding the pots empty by morning, as if the invisible employees had appreciated the gesture. The complex seemed to operate on multiple temporal planes simultaneously. During daylight hours, it remained stubbornly empty and abandoned, showing clear signs of decay and neglect. But at night, particularly during the hours when shifts had traditionally begun and ended, the buildings came alive with echoes of their productive past. The heating systems would kick in automatically, maintaining temperatures appropriate for human comfort, despite the absence of living occupants. Marcus began documenting these experiences in detailed reports that he submitted to his supervisory, though he was careful to describe them as unusual acoustic phenomena and possible electromagnetic interference, rather than supernatural encounters. His supervisor seemed unconcerned, noting that old industrial buildings often produced strange sounds and effects due to their complex mechanical systems and aging infrastructure. The most profound encounter occurred during Marcus's final month at the Riverside complex, when he discovered that his presence had not gone unnoticed by the facility's ghostly workforce. He found a handwritten note tucked under the windshield wiper of his patrol car, written in the careful script of someone accustomed to filling out production reports and time cards. The note read, "Marcus, thank you for watching over our place of work. We know you see us and respect what we built here. The factory may be closed, but the pride we took in our labor lives on. Take care of yourself and know that good work is never truly forgotten, whether in life or beyond." The message was signed with dozens of names, some of which Marcus recognized from old employee rosters and memorial plaques that still hung in the facility's main lobby. Reading those names, he understood that he had been serving not just as a security guard, but as a caretaker for the memories and spirits of people who had devoted their working lives to the Riverside manufacturing complex. When the security company's contract ended and the complex was finally demolished to make way for new development, Marcus made sure to attend the ceremony. As the wrecking ball struck the first wall of Building 3, he could have sworn he heard the distant sound of applause, as if the ghostly workers were acknowledging the end of their long vigil and the beginning of whatever comes next for spirits whose earthly work has finally reached completion. Our seventh and penultimate tale brings us to the mountain town of Ashford, Washington, where park ranger Elena Rodriguez maintained a remote cabin that served as a base for wilderness patrols in Mount Rainier National Park. The cabin sat at an elevation of 4,000 feet, surrounded by old-growth forest and accessible only by a hiking trail that wound through pristine wilderness for 3 miles from the nearest road. Elena had requested the isolated assignment after completing her ranger training, drawn by the opportunity to work in one of the most beautiful and challenging environments the Park Service had to offer. Her duties involved monitoring wildlife populations, maintaining trail markers, and providing emergency assistance to hikers who ventured into the backcountry. The work was demanding but rewarding, offering the kind of solitude and connection with nature that had originally inspired her to pursue a career in conservation. The cabin itself was a rustic but well-maintained structure built by the Civilian Conservation Corps during the 1930s. Its log walls and stone chimney had weathered decades of harsh mountain winters, and its interior featured the simple, functional design typical of Depression-era government construction. Elena had personalized the space with books, photographs, and the various tools and equipment necessary for wilderness work. During her second month at the cabin, Elena began to notice signs that she was sharing the remote location with someone or something else. She would return from day-long patrols to find small items moved from where she had left them. Her coffee mug repositioned on a different shelf, books opened to pages she had not been reading, or her hiking boots arranged in neat pairs despite her habit of leaving them scattered by the door. The disturbances were subtle and never destructive, more like the actions of a considerate roommate than a malicious intruder. Elena initially attributed them to her own forgetfulness or the settling effects of temperature changes on the cabin's wooden structure. Mountain living required adjusting to isolation, and she assumed her mind was simply playing tricks as she adapted to solitary life. The explanation became harder to maintain when Elena began finding evidence of someone else's presence in the surrounding forest. During her morning patrols, she would discover that trails she had cleared the previous day were already maintained, with fallen branches removed and path markers straightened. Her supply caches, hidden at strategic points throughout her patrol area, would be found replenished with items she had not placed there. Emergency rations, first aid supplies, and even fresh batteries for her radio equipment. As our collection of true encounters draws to a close, the rain outside continues its gentle symphony, each drop a reminder that the world holds mysteries far beyond our everyday understanding. Tonight we have journeyed together through tales that speak to something profound about the human experience, our connections to place, to purpose, and to those who came before us. Whether in the archives of forgotten knowledge, the halls of abandoned industry, or the wilderness where nature keeps its ancient secrets, these stories remind us that love, dedication, and the human spirit can transcend even death itself. Let the rhythm of the rain carry you now into peaceful sleep, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, others keep their eternal watch. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me tonight.